Welcome to revision week 7. This time we are looking at client server versus peer-to-peer networks and also network performance, all part of paper 1. Make sure you have revision sheet 7 with you, which was given to you in lesson. Okay, so we're going to start off by looking at network performance. We've looked at types of networks, we've looked at wired versus wireless. There are lots of things that can affect the performance of a network. So have a look at these two here. Different things that could affect the different networks. Well, we've talked about wired and wireless. If you look at these two here, the one on the left has less devices and it's got wired connections here, fiber optic cables. The one on the right has a lot more devices. It's using wireless and other things like that. So clearly, the one on the right would probably be slower overall. There is more data, more devices there. So this is the type of thing you need to think about. Network A versus network B, which would be faster? So some things that you need to know about that affect the performance of a network. The bandwidth. How much data can be carried through the network at one go? Think of it like pipes carrying water. Well, cables carry data. We looked at the types of cables. Fiber optic, for example, would have a higher bandwidth compared to Ethernet cable. So the type of cable that's used will affect the amount of bandwidth used. So the higher the bandwidth is, the more data can be sent in one go. And the more data that's sent, the more bandwidth is used up. For example, if people are streaming videos, it's going to use up a lot more bandwidth. And then if people are just accessing Word documents, for example. The number of users and devices. Very simply, the more users or devices you have on the network, the more bandwidth it's being used up, the more processing time and things through the data going through the network. Lower users, less resources, higher users, more resources, more data, more processing power. Latency. Basically, the delay between the moment the data is sent and when it's received. The bigger the latency, basically the longer the data is taking to travel, and the worse the performance is. Low latency is good, high latency is bad because there's more delay. It might be referred to as lag sometimes. Error rate. As the data is going through the network, sometimes data can get lost or corrupted or collides with other data. Higher error rate means that more data keeps needing to be resent, which is bad for performance. So error rate. The actual type of media that's being used. Wired is usually faster, more reliable than wireless. So the type of cable. Are we using copper cables? Are you using fiber optic cables? Are you using wireless? Also things like the 2.4 versus 5 gigahertz that we talked about last session. The choice of hardware that's used. Sometimes the different devices that are used in the network can have a performance of the network. If it's old hardware or a slow server, it can affect the performance of the network. The topology, the layout of the network. We talked about these in the past as well. For example, a star would be better than a ring network, or a mesh might be better than a star, depending on what it's being used for. The layout of the network. So, key things. Number of users, bandwidth, the media that's used, transmission media, the latency, the error rate, the hardware, the topology. They all affect the performance of a network. So on your sheet here, for the ones that have been given here, write down some notes now. How does it affect the performance of a network? Okay, checking your answers. Purple pen at the ready. So, number of users or devices. The more users devices, the more data being transmitted and the more bandwidth that's used. Bandwidth, the amount of data that can be transmitted through the network. Higher the bandwidth, the more data that can be sent. The network traffic, the type of content being sent to the network. Things like streaming video and stuff. Latency, the delay between sending and receiving data. And the number of errors, the number of errors that are going through the network, things like data collisions or lost packets. These are all things that affect the performance of the network. Also, things like the topology that was mentioned earlier and the transmission media as well. Okay. Regardless of the network topology, hardware or anything else, there are actually only two main types of network. They are peer-to-peer and client-server. So, we've covered this before. Client-server networks is a network that's managed by a central server, a server. Devices connect to the server, they are called clients. Clients send requests to the server processes a request and responds to them. It could be request to log on or receive a file or print something, whatever the request is. It could be accessing the internet or accessing another place on the network, for example. So the server is the powerful computer, the client is the computer which sends the request to the server. What's good about it? Having a central server means it's easier to store your files in a central location. It's easier to perform backups because all the files are in a central location. It's easier to manage security from a central location. And it's easy to install software from a central location. You can literally send and install, update all the computers from that central server. However, it is more expensive to set up. The server is expensive. You need specialists to set it up. The network depends on the server, so if it goes offline, the whole network can be affected. And if the server gets overloaded, if it's too much work, the whole network can be affected. Client server. The other type of network is peer-to-peer. A peer-to-peer network is decentralized. That means there is no central point. There's no central server. All the computers are equal, have equal status. There is no single computer in charge. You can still share files, share devices like printers, but you are not dependent on the server. There is not one device that can break to slow the network down. Okay? However, it is more prone to slowdowns and things like data colliding because the data is not being directed the same. And a peer is just a computer that connects on the network. Good things, it's easier to set up. You don't need expensive hardware. You're not dependent on the server. There's no one server that can break. And you can still do things like share files and devices. However, there is no centralized management. There's no way of updating things, software, security. That has to be done on each computer individually. And the network can also slow down because all the devices are accessing all the computers. Okay, so what type of network is this? This is a peer-to-peer because there is no central server. You may be given a diagram like this in an exam and you might be asked to identify what type of network it is. There is no central server, all the data is stored on the individual computers. How about this one? Well, this is a client server. There is a central server here which all the computers connect to, right in the middle there. All the files are stored on the central server and all the computers connect to it. So on your sheet, client server, peer-to-peer, fill in the sections and then Purple Pen on the next section of the video. Ready to check your answers? Purple Pen's at the ready. So, client server, a network managed by a server, 1 point, where devices connected to the server are called clients. Easy to manage files, backups, easy to install, update software, easier to manage security from a central location. However, more expensive to set up, you need specialists to maintain it, and the network depends on the server. If the server goes off, you lose, the network would fail. Peer-to-peer, a network without a central server where all the devices have equal status. They are all equal. easy to maintain and set up, you do not rely on a central server, and you can still share devices and files. However, no centralized management, things like files, backups, logins, and the network can slow down with different devices all accessing each other. Purple pen, and your answers. Okay, finishing off this week, Learn Cume Revision Quiz 7. As always, check each answer, correct if necessary by trying again. You are aiming to get 100% on this quiz. See you in lesson.